What if the most secretive military base on Earth wasn't built to keep people out, but to keep something else hidden inside? For decades, the government has insisted Area 51 is just a testing ground for advanced aircraft. Nothing more than jets and radar experiments buried in the Nevada desert. But according to long-circulating insider claims and whistleblower accounts, that explanation barely scratches the surface. One former serviceman has said he didn't just see classified technology there. He claims he spent 3 years working alongside beings that weren't human at all. And what he describes raises unsettling questions about who's really in control and how long. They've been watching us. According to his account, everything began with a transfer that made no sense. No briefing, no warning, no explanation. Just sealed orders stamped in red ink and coordinates that didn't officially exist. He was told to pack light, say nothing to anyone, and ask no questions. When he tried to push for answers, his commanding officer didn't explain or reassure him. He simply said that if the job was done correctly, it would be like the assignment never happened at all. That alone was enough to make his stomach turn. But the unease intensified the moment his plane touched down in the desert late at night. There were no runway lights, no markings, no visible structures, just endless sand and a strip of concrete disappearing into darkness. The silence felt heavy, almost unnatural, as if the land itself was suppressing sound. No one said the words Area 51, but no one needed to. Everyone there already knew. For the first few weeks, nothing seemed extraordinary. Patrols, maintenance, routine shifts, long nights under harsh, but subtle details didn't add up. Entire corridors were avoided without anyone giving orders. Some doors had no handles, no seams, just smooth metallic surfaces that reflected your own face back at you. Certain shifts were always understaffed, especially at night. And sometimes, just beyond the reach of the lights, he noticed tall shapes moving slowly through the darkness. They were far taller than any human, moving with a calm precision that didn't feel random or imagined. Whenever he asked about it, conversations stopped immediately. Not because he was told to stop asking, but because no one would respond at all. That silence, he later realized, was intentional. Everything changed the night. 2 unfamiliar officers appeared at his barracks. They wore unmarked uniforms and didn't introduce themselves. One scanned his badge, then his eyes, then his fingerprints. Without speaking, they escorted him across the base to a hangar he'd passed countless times, without a second thought. Behind it was a freight elevator hidden in plain sight. The descent felt endless, far longer than any conventional facility should allow. When the doors finally opened, the air was different, cooler, cleaner, humming faintly like the inside of a massive machine. The hallway ahead curved gently instead of forming sharp angles, and the walls glowed softly without any visible light source. Then, at the far end of the corridor, he saw them. 3 figures stood motionless, each well over 7 feet tall. Their limbs were long and thin, their skin smooth and white, not pale in a sickly way but luminous, almost reflective. Their movements were slow and deliberate, as if every action had been calculated long in advance. Their eyes were large, dark, and impossibly calm. He tried to move, to step back, to run, but his body refused to respond. Panic surged through him until a voice appeared inside his mind, not heard through his ears but placed directly into his thoughts. It told him not to be afraid. There were no moving mouths, no sound in the room, just clear communication delivered with unsettling ease. They identified themselves as what later became known as the Tall Whites. According to what he was told, they had been interacting with Earth for generations, monitoring human development and intervening when necessary. They said he had been selected not by chance, but because he could remain psychologically stable under extreme stress. From that moment on, his life split in 2. During the day, he blended in like everyone else, eating in the mess hall, following orders, pretending nothing was unusual. At night, he went underground into a vast network of chambers far larger than anything built on the surface. He didn't just observe their technology, he worked alongside it. He described craft that hovered silently inches above the ground, surfaces that shifted shape without seams or tools, and systems that responded to thought rather than touch. He watched one craft lift straight upward without heat, without sound, and vanish as if it had slipped into another layer of reality. According to him, this technology wasn't shared freely because humanity wasn't ready for it, and that limitation was deliberate. What unsettled him most wasn't the machinery, but what the Tall Whites knew about humans. They reportedly understood our psychology with disturbing precision, our fears, our hunger for power, our tendency to divide ourselves through belief systems, scarcity, and authority. They spoke about time as non-linear, claiming that past and future existed simultaneously. They said wars were often predictable long before they began, and that certain leaders were destined to rise and fall based on patterns humans barely noticed. Secrecy, they warned, wasn't meant to protect the public from panic. It was meant to protect those in control. That message was repeated often, not as a threat, but as an observation. After nearly 3 years, the work ended as suddenly as it began. He was told his role was complete and that certain memories would be suppressed, not erased, but blurred, like an image left too long in the sun. Before leaving, they gave him a final message that stayed with him long after everything else faded. When the truth is revealed, they said, it will not arrive gently. The next morning, he was reassigned without any debriefing or paperwork. There were no records of where he'd been, no acknowledgement of the time he'd spent underground, just a handshake and a ticket out of the desert. It was as if those years had never existed at all. Since these claims surfaced, they've been dismissed, debated, and quietly buried. Official statements deny everything, while skeptics call it imagination or fabrication. But supporters point to something difficult to ignore. The details in his account never changed. Similar stories from unrelated insiders continue to surface, describing the same beings, the same technology, and the same warnings. Some believe these entities are still operating underground. Others think agreements were made long ago, hidden behind layers of classification. And many are left wondering whether Area 51 isn't truly a base, but a meeting point between species. Because if even part of this story is true, then humanity has never been alone. And the biggest secret in the desert isn't what's flying in the sky, it's who has been watching us the entire time, waiting for the moment when the truth can no longer be contained.